Hello, and welcome to Leaderfolk, an inclusive look inside the Jewish community. I'm your host, Sarah Bogomolny. I'm pleased to welcome 3 guests this week. Joining us today, we have Caroline Kessler, Ava Rosen, and Arielle Tonkin. All 3 of our guests this week are multi-talented artists and Jewish leaders in the Bay Area. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Great. Thank you. So as we jump in, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to introduce yourself, introduce us to how do you identify Jewishly or otherwise, and kind of what is the core of your work. Again, whether that's your artistic work or your Jewish work, we'd love to hear about it. Let's start with Caroline.
Sure. So I'm Caroline. I'm a poet and writer and editor and facilitator living in Oakland. And I'll just say maybe a word about my background. I grew up in an interfaith home with a lapsed Catholic mother and a Jewish father, and was raised Jewish, going to a Reform synagogue, and became really immersed in that world and really felt at home there. And also was writing and making mixed media art and doing some photography. And both of those sort of intersections of my life have evolved a lot over the years, and I've sort of remained in them in different ways, writing poems and short essays that often sort of involve Jewishness or Jewish ritual, not always so explicitly, but sometimes. And then I've also done a lot of Jewish community building. I spent a few years in St. Louis when I was studying creative writing, getting a master's, and started an independent spiritual community there called Ashreinu, which with my co-founder Tasha Kaminsky, which is still going, and ended up writing a bit about that, and that has really informed my poetry. And for the past 2 years, I've been the storytelling and editorial manager at Upstart, which works with bold leaders in the Jewish community, different organizations, ventures, and institutions. And I'll say I've just recently been working on sort of a series of poems that touch on Jewishness, Shabbat, time, and also technology, and thinking a lot about disconnection and connection in this, especially in this strange time. It feels very relevant, but I've been kind of working on these for the past 2 years or so.
Great. I'll be excited to hear more about that. Let's pass it on to Ava.
I'm Ava Rosen, and I am a poet and a visual artist, bookbinder, letterpress printer in San Francisco, and also a Judaic arts educator at Congregation Emmanuel in San Francisco, which is actually where I was bat mitzvahed and had my first job teaching, assisting as a high schooler in the art room that I now am coordinating. So kind of a full circle situation. And I also run an art space, a shared art space called Open Windows Cooperative in the Bayview neighborhood of San Francisco. So it's a shared art studio, collaboration space, workshop space, art gallery. I think just like also I'm exploring earth-based Judaism kind of on my own, and that's kind of the bulk of how I identify with Judaism these days is out in nature.
Beautiful. Thank you. Arielle.
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Arielle, and I am a mixed Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, and Arab Jewish person. And I'm an interdisciplinary visual artist, and I'm rooted in painting practice. And what else can I say? You'd like to know about our Jewish leadership at this time?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So here in the so-called Bay Area, I've been a resident, co-founder, and organizer through the Matriarchy Jewish Communal House for the past almost 7 years. And through my artwork, and my activism since I was a teen. I've been involved in Muslim Jewish organizing, and I'm a co-facilitator through the Muslim Jewish Arts Fellowship. And through my home, I've been doing community organizing for nearly a decade. And in my work, I work as a para-rabbinic artist. I was gifted to get to attend Yeshivat Hadar in 2012 for a year-long Talmud fellowship. And that, combined with my museum education work, has supported me to be doing high holiday leadership, which then morphed into nowadays an interfaith spiritual counseling business, which spans between B'nai Mitzvah education and preparation to Jewish and interfaith ritual facilitation for big congregations and for small groups, and life cycle events, as well as interdisciplinary art gatherings and exhibitions and performances. And I'm currently traveling an exhibition called Orienting Actions, which features and centers a woven hybrid ritual object, which combines a sajda, or a Muslim prayer rug, that unravels into a hanging warp that billows and moves in the gallery and then reweaves to become a Jewish prayer shawl or a talit. And I perform with it, and I've written about it. And it's a stance that I'm taking against the anti-Muslim travel ban in collaboration with Dr. Leila Ozgar Al-Hassan and the Muslim Jewish Arts Fellowship.
Wow, you're all doing such incredible creative things. I'm wondering, as you embark on new projects, new pieces, new lines of thought in your artwork, do you find yourself choosing between this is going to be a Jewish motivated project or this is going to be a not Jewish project? Do you find that your identity is kind of consistent across different aspects of your life? Any of you are welcome to jump in.
I'll say I don't think always so much in terms of projects, but definitely in terms of certain poems. There will be, I would say, a bigger Jewish motivation in certain pieces I'm working on than others. And I'll just give an example because it's, I was working on a poem the other day about a ceremony that happened several years ago during Sukkot. And so the poem was trying to kind of expand beyond the idea of just this Jewish ritual that was happening during Sukkot. But as I was working on it, I thought, well, there's actually not enough Jewish text kind of informing this piece. So it came to be about almost nothing instead of being more specific. So then I went back and was looking at some Talmud and some other sources. And I don't do this for every piece by any means, but it just sort of became clear that this poem needed like a bit more grounding. And then sometimes, it might not be there at all, but just by the virtue of being a Jewish artist, there's maybe some obtuse reference or something that another Jewish reader or writer might understand, but is not there as explicitly. And I'm thinking about a little bit of what Arielle already said in terms of this, like a kind of weaving, a coming in and out of Jewish text and bringing it in certain places and having it maybe be very much at the forefront, and then other times to have it recede a little bit and be more in the background.
Yeah, I think for me, I make work in sort of distinct spaces and communities. And so when I'm at Congregation Emmanuel, I'm designing specifically Jewish art that's art projects that are educational and teaching values and Jewish values and Jewish texts and Jewish practices and rituals and traditions. And then outside of that, a lot of the work I do is not explicitly Jewish, but I think, of course, that Jewish identity, is present, and I think the more Jewish-centered art that I do with the synagogue, the more and the more I meet people like Caroline and Arielle, and have exciting conversations and read exciting writing and see exciting work that is explicitly Jewish, or at least informed by Jewish text or Jewish thought. I get more and more excited about integrating that part of me more explicitly. So I think maybe my work is starting to lean that way, but so far it's a slow process.
Thanks, Ava. Arielle?
One of my dear teachers, Molly Zuckerman-Hartung, who's a painting professor now in Connecticut at Yale, says, and I like to quote her saying, "How I do anything is how I do everything." And whenever these conversations or questions turn to questions of identity and like from which seed of my identity am I making X move or something like that, I just think about like how my body moves through painting and how like the apparatus of my body is inseparable. Like there's no part that's ever not doing, like whether I'm teaching or davening, like praying or painting or engaged in my activism, whatever's happening, every part is connected at all times. So for example, Ava and I have a collaboration right now called Mutual Aid Materials and Their Metaphors. And this project was born from other work that we were doing together that we had to like very, very, very quickly retrofit in the days before shelter in place began here in the Bay Area. And it's just as an outgrowth of who we are and our diasporic identities, our mixed identities, immigrant histories in our family, and our values, all of which are rooted in Jewish identity, Japanese identity, Moroccan identity, Ashkenazi identity. Like this just makes up all of who we are. There's no way for aspects of Jewish lineage to be inseparable from the art that we're making. So just this week, we were coordinating a project that has to do with counting and mimetic practice of counting. And for us this week, we're engaged, both of us, in counting the Omer. And we presented a project that could have, for us, it's rooted in that cultural specificity. When we taught this project of making an abacus and making homemade beads to mark time. But we really quickly realized that touching time is something that every human being is navigating and engaging now in a different way. And as we dropped in and thought about it, we realized that so many lineages involve touching and counting. So everything from the Christian rosary to Tibetan prayer wheels that involve circle, and any ritual of practice that involves rhythm and counting time to mete out breath and connection to source. We realized that, so from our own specific point of origin in Sfirat HaOmer and the counting of the Omer, we then extrapolated back out into the materials we were using. So that's kind of what moves for me and for us in our work together.
I hear a similarity in theme, Arielle, between what you're saying about time and then Caroline, what you had mentioned about your exploration of time in these poems that you've been working on in the past couple of years. And I'm wondering if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I love the idea of touching time. And it's just so visceral. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about secular versus sacred time, and sort of like what we have in a way as in Judaism in terms of Shabbat and festivals that align with new moon and full moon, and like we have a lot of holidays. We have a lot of chances to mark time, and I often feel really grateful and lucky to have that kind of tradition. And then I sort of, look in the poems, I go into the secular world and look at that and say, oh, what do other people have, or what do other people do? And I've been thinking a lot about like what our devices, our phones and computers, how they're affecting our understanding of time and boundaries, and how we have different edges in terms of when we're quote unquote on and when we're off, and when we might be about to slip into a dream state, but maybe we're near the phone, and just kind of what that our entanglement with the devices, like what that really does. And then the kind of obvious parallel is like, well, on Shabbat maybe you're a person who doesn't use a device, or you step sort of outside of time in a particular way, maybe just by going into nature. Maybe you're not keeping Shabbat in a more traditional or sense of halakha, but you might go to nature, or you might go just sit in your garden or on your front porch and say, I'm going to be a little bit outside of time for now. And yeah, it's been an ongoing question for me also of how to be writing about these ideas without also like trying to advertise Shabbat or something, or to say, this is the right way, or this is the way one should do it, because I definitely don't think that's true. I just think, we do have these tools and resources, and there's ways to ground in them, and then there are ways to change them and also have them shape shift so that they, might be useful to you, which, that's an individual question, I think, for a lot of people.
I hear in this discussion of time, something that's more immediate day to day or week to week, but also then kind of a broader idea of generational time and those who have come before us, which leads me into wanting to discuss this beautiful poem that Ava brought to the table as a source text for today. Ava, I'd love if you wanted to give an introduction to the poem, as much or as little as you'd like to say about it, and then if you'd like to read it for us and for our listeners.
I'd love to. Thank you. So this poem is called To/From Annie Albers, and it is titled so because the words and a lot of the phrases are pulled from Annie Albers' On Weaving text. She was a Bauhaus textile artist and was very much focused on materiality and I think perception and interconnectedness and relationship. So yeah, I think I'll leave the context of that and just read it. Any material crystallized as ideas leaves us time to collect ourselves, still amorphous in the realm of things. At its beginning, the one who is making a thing finds themselves alone on new ground, having watched the coming into being a work of art, open, net-like. The ancient instrument that is the hand immersed in the dye bath appears on the surface new in form. It may appear as if made of marble or gold, sparkling as if painted itself. So basic was this twining, this surface play, permitted the opening. Our line of thought, from selvage to selvage, gave shape to color. The result will be timeless shape. This is learning. We must learn to foresee the general air mirrored in others, a soft strip of bark, hides of animals, feathers or flowers, mummy wrappings. To be interwoven in whatever we touch, the soft drape, the gloss of velvets, the word textural, dark and heavy. We have in our hands a small amount of dust, a useful object, though we are often told otherwise.
That's a so good.
Thank you.
What about this piece spoke to the three of you? You all brought it as something that spoke to you that would help unite a conversation about your work. So I'm curious, what resonates for you?
I think I can speak. This is Arielle talking. I had a moment when Ava read this to me, like I felt like my body was coming apart, because sometimes I have these moments with Ava and with Caroline both where it's like as though this could have come out of my own body. I've been touching warp and weft both in my material making practice, in my weaving practice, and also as a metaphor in my interfaith work, in my teaching work, in terms of queer pedagogy, in terms of interfaith identity for many, many years. And I first came to Annie Albers through Joseph Albers, who's the sort of like the Saba Rabba, like the great grandfather of color theory, who was an emigre from Europe, a refugee, and together with his spouse Annie and a bunch of other folks started Black Mountain College at not quite 100 years ago. And Annie's work is it's a cross between weaving and painting in a lot of ways, and it's material, like incredibly intricate, sophisticated craft that also harks back like deeply, deeply to oral tradition. And Annie Albers was super close with Ruth Asawa, who when I read and hear Ava's phrase, a work of art, open, net-like. I also picture these huge undulating Ruth Asawa sculptures and think about how that group of artists who are like great grandparents at this point also produced so much, like at a time of, they were refugees, all of them. And they came together to create a utopic community that was imperfect, but a stab at a dream, like a gesture towards a dream that they made real. And they also did it through teaching. And all of us have teaching practices of various kinds. So the net or the web or the warp and the weft, the weave, is both the objects that we're making and also the relationships that we weave between us. And it's part of our stance against like structural oppression that tries to keep artists down. And so there's a lot to say about it. I love this piece by Ava. I cherish it.
Yeah, I love this. I love this piece too, Ava. And I'm new to Annie Albers and her work, and I was just reading about her a bit before we spoke, and thinking about how the Ava and Arielle, both of your works, I like, and the way that you are in the world, I really think of the work you do as weaving and very much in collaboration with other people and other spaces and a lot of ideas. I mean, I think so many artists do that, but I was excited to have the conversation between the three of us, especially because of that weaving that you both do. And then reading the piece, it was almost like a mirror for my own work, thinking about how I weave different kinds of text. And recently I've been wanting to weave in other material that's not just text, like drawings or something more visual. And still, I'm not sure exactly how that will happen, but there's definitely a process where I'm looking at this part, a soft strip of bark, hides of animals, feathers or flowers, mummy wrappings. Like there's the weaving of those physical things, but then there's also, just putting those 4 lines together in a poem is really a kind of weaving, and taking, found text or overheard dialogue or, something that happened to you. That's a kind of weaving that I often see, in writing that I really love. And especially in this poem, and to have kind of, as Arielle said before, a place where we can kind of come together and push against a text a little bit too, I think is really, it's a really exciting place to start, even for a sort of like mini collaboration, which is this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'll just echo what you two said, because you said it all. But yeah, I think weaving is a metaphor that I think of often, and that I feel is happening every time we collaborate, and also, respond to someone else's writing, use existing materials, maybe that's someone else's handmade, and reworking it is just kind of like an act of magic to me, and sort of shape shifting, and just transformation, essentially. And I love like thinking of Annie Alber's work and the like Arielle and Caroline's work that just like makes those sort of transformations and connections that we might not realize or think about in our day-to-day lives, just bring it to the surface and make it really shine and catch our attention. And I think that's like just such a powerful quality that art and writing and, all the creative disciplines can offer us, especially at this time and at all times, all the time.
I really picked up on weaving around 2016. I was feeling heartbroken by the news that I was hearing from Standing Rock, and very, very deeply moved by artists and activists from all over the country who were going and connecting to interfaith ritual that was happening there in solidarity and in protest. And as the months unfolded and the election and everything was happening as 2016 turned into 2017, I found myself taking up weaving on an old-fashioned wooden 4-heddle floor loom as just like a mimetic, sort of like simple rhythmic action that wouldn't be as elaborate as painting or as narrative or as rooted in complexity and expertise and the full literacy that I contend with every time I sit down to paint, but just like a super simple beginner's mind activity that would be just like back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And there's something about just that like systole, diastole, in breath, out breath, back, forth, that is something I always ground in when I'm doing my rabbinic style artwork as well, of like in times like ours, like we're in the middle of a pandemic talking with you right now. What's the most basic mark that I can make? What's the most simple home base mode in my body that I can drop into? That's like even maybe not even the simplest action I can do, but the simplest non-action that I can do. Like how can I just be for a second? And so weaving really echoes that very basic heartbeat of the body. And in my life had offered me like a beginner's mind, kind of get back to basics, learn how to learn something new. And so, yeah, I think there's something there that feels very close to home for this moment as well. And somehow holding that in paradox with the fact that Annie Albers is a prodigal weaver and writer. And her weavings are super mathematically intricate, and her use of color, while much more muted than her spouse's, who is making these very bright, vivid color theory practices, are like super, super intricate use of color theory as well. And I'm thinking also about how Judaism and other religions use geometry and pattern and math to gesture towards like abstractions of the divine. And Ava might tell a little bit about this. We've been also reading a lot, a text called Braiding Sweetgrass, which weaves between like the wonder of the natural world and like the incredible colors and fractal geometry and quantum physics, like mind-blowing expressions of the divine that come through in nature. And with weaving like Annie's and like use of math and pattern that's that intricate, it also feels transcendent in that way and gestures towards something bigger than the cloth itself.
One thing that I'm hearing as we talk about weaving and about this in and out, I'm also thinking about this kind of in and out of metaphor and the literal that I think happens a lot with religious, that we have kind of like a spiritual practice and then we have the literal physical actions, and that's another form of weaving together what is tangible versus what is spiritual. And I wonder how that idea might apply to your work. Maybe it's translating from your artwork into some of the community organizing or the activism that you've done, and where those layers kind of intersect.
Mine is like, so I just talked a lot. Mine is like very, very literal in that most recently I've been engaging ritual objects in the expanded fields kind of thing. But I think probably all of our work in some way is to the extent that we've all had material physical making practices, and we all also have really active writing practices. All three of us have touchstones in rituals of writing, rituals of making, and very, very literally creating Jewish and otherwise ritual objects. It was a blast to see this Hanukkah. So Ava is like one of the experts of this now. Like through her work, she's coming up with projects all the time, like ritual objects in the expanded field. And I walked into her home a few months ago. It was Hanukkah time, and there was this Chanukiah that she had rigged. How do you explain it, Ava? It was like, what were those found metals? Were they cookie cutters?
Cookie cutters.
Ava found these like stunning, super simple, like, can you imagine just like holiday cookie cutters around? There were these curly cues, and she had like very simply hot glued them together into this trellis. And so you looked at it, the light was hitting it. It looked like this like super, super fancy, expensive, elaborate curly cues of metal, and she had elevated it from the most humble of materials that she probably found at scrap in San Francisco. So that's also like, I feel like even Caroline, who I'm still getting to know, like mobilizing materials of contingency for holiness and for delight and for play is something that I've seen across all of our work as well, for sure. And to the extent that we've all had different inputs of Jewish tradition, and then each of us also have other faith backgrounds as part of our heritages as well, like we're infusing that into the objects that we touch all the time and into our teaching as well. And I guess like portability has probably been a big theme for each of us, whether in Caroline's case, like moving between the Bay and the Midwest, and figuring out how to bring a writing practice and relationships and community building work between the places. Or in my case, I was playing around with portals and portable holes, and how could I make a weaving that would be an escape hatch that would defy a travel ban? Oh, okay, like maybe there can be a house of worship that's folded up under the arm and tucked in a suitcase that could defy a legal order in that way. So yeah, that's a little bit. But yeah, Ava could give you a list of like 100 awesome things specific to what you just asked, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like metaphor and literal action, like they're hard to separate for me. Like the action is really like the action, or the object is like the anchor that brings me to a feeling or a thought that is otherwise pretty hard for me to access, honestly. And so the object does feel like a portal, and the, you know, like the ritual of repetitive action does feel like a portal into whatever metaphor that we're working with at the moment. And I think also Arielle and I were talking about collective ritual and collective action, and, you know, like just how powerful, you know, when, you know, counting the Omer right now, like just thinking about how so many people are counting together from their homes or wherever they are. And that action, so participating in that action feels like a connection to more than me or my individual self.
I'm curious, as I kind of look over your bios before we spoke and hear you speaking now about your balancing your art and then also community leadership, and also knowing how often artists make art to be interpreted by the viewer without trying to lay, you know, a specific directive on. Do you view your art as an act of Jewish leadership, or does that feel separate?
I think so. I did this fellowship called Dorot, in which I lived in Tel Aviv for a year and wrote a lot and volunteered and did many things which are not really, I mean, they were interesting to me at the time. But the reason why I bring this up is because that the fellowship, which kind of ostensibly curates a group of Jewish lay leaders, they actually don't really like to use this phrase like a group of leaders. They talk a lot about exercising leadership, and it's a sort of subtle difference. But when I heard that frame, I found it really useful, because I think there's something sort of, I grapple with this idea of saying, oh, look at me over here, like I'm raising my hand, I'm a leader, versus a more organic process of like facilitation, like which I think of as facilitating something that already exists and it just needs to be coalesced. Like this community I helped create in St. Louis, I actually, like, it was really already there, and I was just coming in almost from the outside and helping coalesce something. And so in that way, I like to think of it as like exercising some skill of leadership, because then also you can exercise that in a lot of situations, maybe not even so overtly all the time. But more to the point of your question, I tend to think of my art as pretty separate, I would say, from a lot of this more traditional, quote unquote, exercising leadership that I've done. But it doesn't mean that that those practices don't inform each other. But I think there's also, maybe we should mention also the way the three of us met, although in dyads we had met in other ways, but the three of us came together at a retreat in Mill Valley put together by an organization called Asylum Arts, and it was this sort of Bay Area Jewish artist retreat last fall. And there was something really special about being in that space with a bunch of people who have really, really different Jewish identities, and how they were thinking about their art and their Jewishness or not. And not to say exactly what Arielle said in the beginning, but I just think it's so relevant to mention like that. Of course, these identities are informing, what we do. And sometimes the art just feels sort of separate to me, and like it's happening, informed by my Jewishness, but not in this context of, say, making a commentary in the Jewish community or something.
Yeah, I really relate to what you're saying, Caroline. I think, I never consciously, thinking about, how can I be a leader in the Jewish community? But that facilitation, the word facilitation feels really apropos, especially because a lot of the work that I do is education, and really creating opportunities for other people to make art. And that's really a big focus of my practice, is like prompting or inviting other people into some sort of creative practice. So I think in that way, it is Jewish leadership, I think, but I think that it's, I think it's really just people, in my experience, people really just need the invitation, or the question or the prompt, and then they're set, and they can just go do their amazing art practice. And all I'm doing is really just creating that context for it to start in a way.
I love this idea of leadership as creating opportunities or offering an invitation, extending an invitation. I think that's a really kind of egalitarian way to look at leadership.
I was just thinking about the Hebrew word for a leader is a manhig, and the root is mem nun gimel. Mem nun gimel, not mem nun gimel, but the core of the word is mem nun gimel. Mem nun hey yud gimel, and a minhag is just not even an anagram of those letters. It's just a different valence, and it means custom. And so from manhig to minhag, I think for me in my life, I've had the privilege to be a host in the very literal sense of hosting a meal and a convener. And as an artist, I'm always working with frames, conceiving concepts inside of frames and making paintings, but also just thinking about what are the bounds of this home? What's the periphery of this table? What can I fit at this table? Who can sit down with me here? What can happen here? What can unfold here? And then having just all the infrastructure of customs that comes through Jewish lineage and beyond, has been those minhagim have coincidentally and given me opportunity to hold space and influenced also in my art, the aesthetics and the materials and the forms of the containers that I've made. And especially the privileges that I've had in my life, a lot of my opportunities have come through Jewish community, whether starting when I was a young one and my Saba sent my sisters and I to day school as little kids in early elementary school, and then later on in my life through the gift of Mechon Hadar, and now in my adult life, the gift of the Svara community, and countless other Jewish communities, the Congregation Beth Israel community, the Kehila Community Synagogue in Oakland, numerous Jewish organizations have lifted up and seeded me with support in ways that I think it's been more challenging in the art world in a lot of ways, just in terms of how systems of power move. And so I think I've been gifted with revisiting Jewish lineage in my art practice also because it's been Jewish communal support that's given me infrastructure and tables with which to spread my minhagim, my customs, and from there to step into manhigut, into leadership, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's interesting. This brings up so many questions.
Yeah, I was thinking that same thing, Arielle, and like the retreat that Caroline mentioned, that like I was at a point where I was thinking about like closing Open Windows Cooperative, the art space that I organize, and like I don't know, it was just like not sure what I was doing or if what I was doing was like worthwhile or something. And that invitation to join that group of people and being with everyone for 4 days was truly transformational. And yeah, that like someone invited me to be a part of that. And then I felt like we all really like uplifted each other, and it was just such a uplifting experience and supportive, and I feel like there's no way that I would be doing any of the work that I'm doing if it hadn't been for specific people to be like, why don't you do this thing with me, or like come be on this podcast with me, or all the things that help me to grow as an artist and a person, and really sort of challenge me to grow into that.
Thank you all for being here today and engaging in this discussion. I have learned so much, and I feel really grateful for your time, for your thoughts, for sharing your expertise. Before we go, I'd like to ask each of you just one last question, which is, we've only talked very briefly about the pandemic and the shelter in place, but I know that it is obviously a consuming topic and it's affecting all of us in different ways. But I would love to know, what are you most looking forward to when shelter in place ends and the world begins to find its way back to whatever normal means?
I love that question. I'm really excited to sing with people in a group where we can hear each other singing. I've joined some really sweet song circle. I mean, it's all coming. I feel like literally any Zoom gathering I've joined recently has just been a Jewish one, because it somehow feels like just the right amount of spiritual and dropped in. And so there's been a lot of singing, and you can see people's lips moving, but obviously because of the dissonance in the internet speed and all these things, we can't be singing together. And I just really miss that like vibration that happens when people are in a room, kind of lifting their voices together. So really, among many other things, that's just what first comes to mind, is looking forward to that, however it will happen in the new reality.
I love that, Caroline. Thank you.
Yeah, I immediately thought of band practice. I don't think I mentioned that I'm in a band, but like that's one thing that has not, we haven't figured out a way how to adapt to the now with that. So it's just not been happening. And it really is such like a big, important part of my own like mental health, and like releasing a lot of like energy with friends. So I'm really looking forward to getting back in the practice space.
Thanks, Ava.
And releasing our album.
Oh my gosh.
Which
Yeah.
has been delayed again.
Ava, plug your album.
We have an album coming out. We're called Galore. It's coming out on Rocks in Your Head Records at some point. Maybe June 1st, but who the heck knows?
Where can we get
it? Rocks in Your Head, the Rocks in Your Head Records website. Not sure what. Yeah.
We'll put a link in the show notes. And Arielle, what are you looking forward to?
The truth is I'm like very much also sitting in, like, my studio is now moved to my bedroom and switched from oil paint to acrylic paint. And I'm always teaching and working with my students around like productive restrictions and constrictions and for art making. And so I think, I was supposed to go to Morocco and teach in Jerusalem this summer and do all this work that was contingent on travel. But after grieving all of that, like, I think I'm really grounding into these words that I heard yesterday from a bishop who's based in Oakland named Yvette Flunder, who's an incredible elder, who said something to the effect of, grief is not the same as loss of faith. And so I think after moving through the grief of the loss of those trips and those residencies and all that teaching in other places, I'm really just present in my home and making what I can make from here. So I'm not in this moment connected to what's going to happen immediately after. I think I'm even more connected to how will I stay grounded in the real deep sense in my body that everything I have is where I am once this period is over.
Everything I have is where I am. Is that what you said? I love that. Well, thank you to Caroline, to Ava, to Arielle for joining us for this discussion today. I will include in the show notes links to them and their work so that you can keep up and keep an eye on what they're doing, both in the art world and the Jewish world. And thank you again to the three of you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Leaderfolk is all about elevating voices and starting conversations. So now we'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcast@tcjewfolk.com to share your thoughts or ideas or to nominate future guests. Leaderfolk is a project of Jewfolk Inc. and the Jewfolk Podcast Network. For more information, visit tcjewfolk.com/podcast.